What's up, everybody? Ben Razamakijeski here for Odd Chopper for betting you for the Big Ten. All things college football. We are ready to talk another conference, put it in the books. We're going to break down the best bets from the entire Big Ten conference. Which teams may make the playoffs? Which teams may not win any games? We've got all of that and more here on this episode. If you're listening in podcast form, we appreciate it. You can get this available in podcast anywhere you get podcasts. Rate and review. It really does help us out. If you're on YouTube, hit the like button, subscribe to this channel. A lot of college football content coming this year. Yesterday, Mr. Gajeski, we talked a little Pac-12, and I asked the same thing I'm going to ask you now. What are your overall thoughts of this conference as we delve into Ohio State and Michigan and some of the premier teams in the country?
Yeah, you always ask me this question about the conferences, and I feel like I never say anything bad because I love college football so much. Even if I got this question about the MAC, I'd be like, oh man, love the MAC,
MAC's
love
the
Tuesday
best.
nights.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yes.
As far as Big Ten goes, I am a fan of this conference, and I think more so than any other year, we're seeing a bit of a revolution in the West. Ton of new coaches, ton of new philosophies, new quarterbacks. I don't know if that makes a huge difference this year, and it's the last year with divisions, so we'll see how they start approaching the schedule moving forward. But I think it's just a little too late for a lot of those West teams. And then, of course, we have the powerhouses in the East that everyone knows and loves. This is a premier conference, likely to get at least one playoff team in, oftentimes getting two. So there's a ton to talk about. A lot of really good talent in this conference.
Yeah, I think we've seen that now for, the Big Ten title game. Kind of a joke lately. It's Ohio State and Michigan are battling, and then they play like Iowa or Northwestern for just reasons. And it's like a 3-touchdown spread. We'll talk about maybe if we think a team can challenge one of those, maybe it won't be them. That is what we're here to determine. And there's no better team to start with. As I bring up the odds we're going to be going through, I mean, Ohio State would have won the national championship last year. That's not a stretch in my mind. They gave Georgia all they can handle. They've got talent. Now, of course, they've got massive turnover. Stroud is gone 10.5 wins. Basically, minus 110 on both sides. A little juice to the under. I want you to talk about maybe Kyle McCord or whoever will take the reins here. And what do you see from Ohio State? Are they once again a very, very likely playoff team?
I do think they're a very likely playoff team. They'd be my pick from this conference, and we'll get into why as we break down each roster. I think they should be favored at least. There's a couple other teams I like. But you mentioned the new quarterback, a lot of continuity in the staff. Brian Hartline's going to be the new OC. He's the former receivers coach, so shouldn't see too much change there. Dale have his say, of course. Knowles has brought this defense a tick up each season, so hopefully they can improve again, and we'll get into that. But really the biggest question is McCord. He's a former former 5-star recruit, but we haven't seen him at all. We've been through this multiple times with Ohio State now. We just most recently saw it when they went from Justin Fields to CJ Stroud. And why I have confidence in McCord, the weapons around him. I mean, you have two premier backs in Trevion Henderson, Mayan Williams. You have Dallin Hayden, who had to start games for them down the stretch. They're going 3-4 deep. And then the receivers. I don't think much needs to be said here. Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming. They recruit Carnell Tate. Like, they have the dudes of the future on this roster. And because they've been so successful, I think they'll be able to keep them. Cade Stover's back at tight end. Offensive line is the biggest question outside of quarterback. You lose both of your tackles. You do have really good recruits here. Players like Zen Mikowski, Josh Fryer. They just haven't played before. They kind of put a Band-Aid over this by getting Josh Simmons from San Diego State in the portal. He was not good starting at San Diego State, so I don't have a lot of confidence in him. And the fact that you needed to bring him in, all right, what's the confidence level with your tackles coming into the season? That could be a concern. Defense, I think, is going to be a lot better. You lost 4 DBs, 2 defensive linemen, but you only had 1 guy drafted from a team basically that should have been in the national championship. To only have 1 of your defenders drafted, the guys you're losing, I mean, you're being replaced by elite recruits now. I think this is actually a positive for them. You have Sawyer and Tumaloa on the edge. Interior runs like 4 or 5 deep. You return 3 DBs with starting experience. You get 2 good transfers in Jahad Carter from Syracuse and David Abegoson from Ole Miss. With Knowles at the helm here, I think this is another incremental step forward and puts their defense a little closer to Michigan, which might be enough here. Schedule's tough I think, the toughest out of the big three here. Michigan's at home, luckily. Penn State's at home, but you travel to Notre Dame, you travel to Wisconsin. You're just not seeing those kind of games on the schedules of Michigan and Penn State in particular. So it's a bit tougher. With that said, I do think Ohio State still has the roster to get through those games unblemished and put themselves in the title picture here. A lot of this is going to come down to that finale. And I mean, excuse me, I think I said I was at Ohio State. This game is at Michigan.
Yeah, it's at Michigan. It's even worse.
Yeah. So you've got 3 of those games on the road and Penn State at home. It's definitely a tough road, but you have the talent to get it done here. And I think the best bet for me is just them to win the Natty at plus 650. It's not great odds, but it's much better than them to win the East or to win the Big Ten or their win total with the hard schedule, in my opinion. Like, if they do those things, they probably have a decent shot to win the Natty because they have to go through a bunch of tough opponents on the way.
I don't really like the win total only because of what you're describing. If they get to 11, they're going to make the playoff most likely, in my opinion. So you can get better odds in other type of actionable markets without needing them to do really much more. Obviously, if they win 10 games, I don't see any way they make the playoff. So it's just one of those situations. I'd rather look to that. I don't have a real play here. I think they're going to be very good, as you do. It's Ohio State. I'll tell you though, lately, just in the very short term, these teams have started to find a way, particularly Michigan. I mean, we saw what was a decent upset and Harbaugh broke through. And then last year, Michigan really took it to them. They ran it down their throat. They get this game at home. They have made the playoff past couple years. Running to Georgia one year wasn't good. The TCU thing, say what you want. They're also at 10.5 wins, and they're actually slightly juiced to the over. I don't know if that's more of a product of the schedule, in your opinion, if Michigan is just better than Ohio State. As I scroll through all the directional Michigans to find them, here we go. Michigan, 10.5, minus 120. Harbaugh suspended for the made-up games. I'm sure that doesn't matter. What do you see from Michigan, McCarthy, and everything else for the Wolverines?
Yeah, the win total here, it's juiced towards the over a little bit because of the schedule. Ohio State has Notre Dame in non-con. Michigan has East Carolina, UNLV, and Bowling Green. They should be no less than 4-score favorites in all of those games. They also drew a better West. You've got Nebraska, Minnesota, Purdue. Those should all be very clear wins for Michigan. You have 2 hard games the whole year. You have Ohio State and you have Penn State. So right away, much, much easier draw for the Wolverines here. I do have questions with the roster. J.J. McCarthy is back at quarterback. You've got the same staff. That's positive. But McCarthy's a limited signal caller, and he's going to have to take a step forward if this team is going to win a national championship. We talked about this a lot last year. What happens when Michigan plays from behind? And they rarely do so. But I always question, do they have the quarterback and do they have the horses at wide receiver to potentially come back in a game? And we still have questions about that. They weren't able to do it against TCU when they got a lead. They did have some solid production there, but you lose Ronnie Bell at receiver. You're relying on Roman Wilson, Cornelius Johnson. Those are pretty highly recruited players, and I think the offense limits them more than their own individual talent. You do have a couple 4-stars coming in, Romello English, but really you didn't address the position whatsoever when you lost some of your depth, like Angel Anthony. Those players are gone. So now you're thinner at the position. You lost your number one. I'm not sure if you're better. At tight end, you lost Schoonmaker and Eric All. Luckily, Colston Loveland had to play a decent amount last year. You grab A.J. Barner from Indiana. He played a lot, but he was one of the least efficient players in the conference. We'll see if that was a product of Indiana's system or if it had anything to do with Barner. I happen to think he's decent. Like Ohio State, you lose 2 starters in the O-line. I think they portaled better guys here. Drake Nugent from Stanford, Ladarius Henderson from Arizona State. I do think this is a very good unit, which should pave the way for Blake Corum, Donovan Edwards. That's the strength of this team on offense. Defense, I think, is going to be pretty good. You lose 3 DBs. You lose 2 defensive linemen. I'm kind of concerned about the departure of Mozzie Smith on the interior. He's an absolute stud. To fill the void at defensive back, you portaled in Josh Wallace from your UMass.
Damn right. Bringing in the big boys.
He's like a 4-year starter, though. He's probably their best player last year. Right. So decent get, even though you see the UMass, you're like, I don't know about this guy. He's a pretty good guy. Plus, they have some freaks like a Marion Walker behind him. I do think the defense is going to be very good. I do think the gap is narrowing on defense between Ohio State and Michigan. And then the offense, I give a strong edge to Ohio State still. So I'm probably just going to bet Ohio State in this game. I don't hate Michigan to make the playoff at plus 105, but I don't think they have a roster capable of winning the national championship with their quarterback and receivers. What do you think about the Wolverines? Do you see this similarly to me?
I do. I just don't. First of all, again, I'll say the same thing. If you're going to bet over 10.5, I would just bet them to make the playoff at plus money. I think most of the scenarios and decision trees, we saw already that Ohio State and Michigan can coexist in the playoff. It's not the ideal situation. Even if that's your one loss, you can still get in. You'd both have to handle Penn State, who we'll get to in a second. I don't know. I'd say for me, it's going to have to be more of a balanced attack. The problem with Michigan, it's a double-edged sword. They're so dominant up front that when they play all these bozo teams, they're never tested, so you never see what's going to happen. And then they get into real elite games at the end. And sometimes it still doesn't happen. And then they get into the playoff and they play Georgia, and it's like, oh, this is a problem. So I'm confident in them. I think they're going to have a very good year, as does everybody else. But I didn't run to the window. They're not on my betting card yet, and I haven't. I might bet them to make the playoff, as you mentioned, but that's about all I can say for them at this point. I don't really have – I'd rather bet Ohio State to win the national championship than Michigan, to be honest.
I agree with you, and I don't want this to seem like a slight to Michigan. I think they have a very good roster, and I actually think McCarthy probably takes a step forward this year. My question is just, is that enough? How much of a step does he actually need to propel this team to a national championship? I think it's quite a big gap here. So even with a better JJ McCarthy, I'm not sure they have the ability to do it. Schedule's easy, but I'm probably not going to play either of these teams because I think I like the team we're going to talk about next.
You and me both. And you can put this, you can clip this. My first win total bet this year is the team we're about to talk about right now, and they are going to have a serious say in who makes the playoff because Penn State is no joke this year. Over 9.5 at minus 140. It is juiced. I grabbed this quite a bit ago. I dropped it in our Discord. We'll talk about Discord in a second, but Penn State has got some guys, and Clifford, I'm not going to say mercifully because, listen, he played there for a long time, but it's a new regime now. Drew Aller, whatever his name is. We've seen it. He's got weapons. He's got a stud running back. I don't know about this team. I think this is a super dangerous team. They've got some of the big games at home, as we've already talked about. It's impossible to play in there. How dangerous is Penn State this year?
I think they're really dangerous. And this is a team that's been on the come up for a while now. Drew Aller, he's former 5-star recruited quarterback, should be better than Clifford with time based on that recruiting pedigree. Great tandem at running back, Singleton and Katron Allen. They're right up there with Ohio State and Michigan in terms of their running back tandem. And I think they're going to be running behind the offensive line of the year in the Big Ten. I think this is maybe the best offensive line in the country. You have 6 players returning with at least 200 snaps, and you have plenty of full-time starters. The premier player on this offensive line is Olu Fashanu. He's right now the betting favorite to be the number 1 tackle taken in the NFL draft. This dude's an absolute stud. I think at receiver, you have a couple questions. You lose Parker Washington and Mitchell Tinsley. Neither of them were really an alpha last year anyway, so what is the step back? I'm not sure it'll be much. You do have Keandre Lambert-Smith. He's played a lot. Harrison Wallace got in the field late last year. You had Dante Cephas from Kent State, Malik McLean from Florida State. That should help fill some of the gaps. And then you do have some depth guys, some players that are former 4-star recruits that are young. Maybe one of them can step up. Defense, I think you have a couple issues, but this defense should be pretty nasty. You lose 3 DBs, 2 on the defensive line, 1 linebacker. Your biggest losses are in that secondary with Brown and Joey Porter Jr. gone. Every starter on the defensive line played at least 100 snaps last year, and they have so much depth. Plus, like some premier players, Chop Robinson, Adisa Isaac. Those are great players on the edge. To replace Brown and Porter in the secondary, I love Kalen King and Johnny Dixon. Their secondary projects to be a weakness, if you will. I think it's just a weakness in relation to the other positions here. This should still be a very strong defense. And I do believe they've closed the gap with Ohio State and Michigan. I do not think this is a team that you can just walk over immediately. And I'm going to bet them to win the national championship 22-1. You can find them plus 550 to win the Big Ten. I love both those numbers. Shop them so you can get the best line here. But I think you're dealing with a pretty easy schedule too. You obviously play Ohio State and Michigan. You split those home and road. Your toughest game from the West is Iowa. That's at home. That's your whiteout game. I don't know, man. There's a lot of paths to Penn State winning this conference.
A lot of paths to them winning the conference and a lot of paths to cashing different types of tickets, because you just mentioned, 22-1, over 5-1, some of the higher risk, higher reward type paths, and I see them. How the hell do you not win 10 games? Even if you lose both Ohio State and Michigan, and I'm not saying that's unlikely, but I think they have a better chance to split than win both or lose both. You still should be pretty sizable favored in the other 10 games. Like, I don't see where the third loss comes. You could get knocked off at any week, but it would take an upset, because Iowa at home or at Michigan State, at Maryland, I mean, those are games that you really should win. You look at non-con, they're a 20-point favorite over West Virginia. They've got Delaware and UMass as the other two. Obviously, those are 3 wins. Even in a not successful year for Penn State, I think they go 10-2.
I 100% agree with you. I really don't have anything else to add. I love this team. The one thing I guess I'll add is tiebreaker situations. If we see all of these teams end up 1-1, that's Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State, like beat one, lose to one, and they end up in a tiebreaker, that goes down to strength of schedule, and Penn State has the weakest. So, and that largely comes from their West opponents. They play like Northwestern and stuff. Just something to note. I'm still going to bet it. You're getting paid off for any of those situations, so no issues there, but just at least worth noting.
Absolutely worth noting it, and it's a good call just to make sure. But there are definitely options there, and I mentioned already, this was actually my first bet that I dropped in Discord, and I will just give a quick shout out to BetMGM and what they're doing right now. You see it on the screen, $1,000 in bet credits plus 2 free months of our Discord. I'll bring it up on the screen so you guys can see this offer. Again, if you don't have access to as many books as maybe you would like, as maybe as you could, you haven't played on BetMGM before football season, it's not the worst idea to take just a little of your bankroll and throw it over there, just so you have access to those lines. In addition, of course, you're going to get these, the opportunities from BetMGM and the Discord for 2 months. But just having the ability to steal a couple points here and a couple points there over the course of a season adds up a ton. So the links are below. Hop in there and be set up for football for as much opportunities for success as possible. Now, we talked about 3 teams. We could just shut it down, get breakfast. I got a lot of things to do today. I guess we'll keep going, but it jumps off. I'm not going to say a cliff, but it's kind of a cliff, because Maryland is up next, and I don't know if they're a serious threat to do much of anything. It's a 7-win total, but it's a pretty simple question. How big is that drop off from, I'll call them the big 3, to Maryland, and what do you see from this team?
I do think it's significant. And I like Maryland. If you played in a conference that didn't have divisions, maybe they would have a better chance of going somewhere, or if you just restructured. But unfortunately, that's not the case. This team has a 7-win total here. I think they're favored in 9 games, assuming that you have health, and that's a big key here we'll talk about. But I like Loxley, mainly as a recruiter. He's their head coach. He recruits extremely well, getting players to a Maryland program, which is not necessarily a destination on the national radar. You do have new OCs. Josh Gaddis and Kevin Sumlin are going to co-OC this. I don't know what to think of Gaddis. He had the awesome year with Michigan, won whatever you call the assistant coach of the year award. I don't know. I can't remember the name of it, but he won it. And then he goes to Miami, completely ruins Van Dyke, has a terrible year and gets fired. So what do we actually have in Gaddis? I'm not sure. Very rare you see a guy winning, assistant coach of the year and then getting fired this subsequent season. Tagovailoa is back at quarterback. He's the key to this win total. Without him, this team is horrible, and I'm not sure they're better than teams like Rutgers. So ultimately, I cannot bet Maryland's win total because he's been injured before. This offensive line is a huge concern, which we'll get to. But I mean, they probably win 9 games if Tagovailoa stays healthy the whole year. They might not make a bowl if he gets injured early. Aside from him, 2 running backs back, Hemby and Littleton, that's solid. Your receivers, I think, are okay. You lose Raheem Jarrett and Copeland, but you portal in Caden Prather and Tyrese Chambers. Prather is a former 4-star from West Virginia. Getting to this O-line, you lost 4 starters here and some depth. You only have 2 starters returning. They portaled their way to some contributors, but I have massive, massive questions about this offensive line. And I'm not sure what the ceiling is here, but when you look at their offensive line against the fronts of Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, those defenses are going to absolutely have a field day. Maryland lost their top 7 contributors on the defensive line as well. Trench warfare here is not going to be a strength for Maryland, and you're going to have to go up against those opposing rushing attacks too. You have to face Singleton and Allen and Henderson and Williams and Corum and Edwards. They're going to get demolished by those teams. And I mean, with the offensive line concerns, Tagovailoa might end up getting hurt here. As far as your DBs too, you don't lose as much there. You only lose 2 guys, but Bennett and Banks are both NFL players. So now you have DB as a potential weakness too. I still think you're better than Michigan State, Rutgers, and Indiana. But I mean, I'm really worried about this team health-wise. They're working on really thin margins, which is why I can't bet the win total, even though today they would be favored in 9 games.
Yeah, the schedule is very, very favorable. There's very real scenarios where they're 5-0 going into Ohio State. They can drop all the big time games that are on their schedule and breeze past this. But you mentioned a pretty high variance team, minus 155 to the over on 7. I mean, it's not my favorite, to be honest. It would be over pass for me if you're looking to make a bunch of win total bets. But ultimately, I see this in line with you. And there's just other spots I would rather go to. And it starts maybe with the team we're about to talk about right now, and not in a good way, with Michigan State. We were talking about somebody, I think Washington, who has them on the schedule. And we kind of alluded that Michigan State, there could be some issues here. It's a 5.5 win total, juice to the under, and I think it should be juice to the under. Do you see them improving, or is this another down year in East Lansing?
I think it's a down year. I think you have a coaching staff in the hot seat. I don't know if you actually can fire Mel Tucker because of all the money they paid him. That's a significant buyout. But this roster is in turmoil. You lost Peyton Thorne after the spring. You don't have a quarterback on the roster. You have Caden Hauser, Noah Kim, freshman Sam Levitt. I don't know who starts out of them. I'm not confident in whoever starts out of them. Running back, I think, is fine. You return Jalen Berger. You add Nathan Carter from UConn and Jaron Mangham as a kick return scat back out of USF. But Kenneth Walker is not walking through that door. None of those players can take the offense and propel it to be competitive against the other teams in this conference like Kenneth Walker did. You lose your top 2 receivers in Jaden Reed and Kean Coleman. It goes deeper than that, though. You also lost some of your recruits. Like they had a 4-star in Jeremy Bernard. He transferred to Washington. So some of the players that were projected to take the spots of Reed and Kean Coleman, at least the talented ones, are gone. So now you're relying on completely unproven players of low recruiting pedigree with an unproven quarterback. This pass game is going to be a complete mess. Offensive line tentatively should be better. They've been so hurt over the last couple of years that even with 2 starters departing, you have 5 guys who have plenty of starting experience. They're actually pretty good pass blocking last year. They ranked 27th. I think they'll take a start back just because Jarrett Horst and Matt Carrick were decent starters for this team, especially Horst. He was their best offensive lineman, and he's gone. But, I mean, how high can they actually ascend? Defense is going to be a mess. I think your strength is linebacker. Interior defensive line is fine, but your edge group is horrifically thin. You lost both your starting edges. Secondary is a huge concern. You only lost 1 corner, but I mean, none of these players were any good to begin with. So I do not think Michigan State's hanging around with any teams here. And, you know, my question right now is how much better are they than Rutgers? With all of the turmoil on offense, I'm not sure they're going to score a lot more points than Rutgers this year.
Well, they better get Rutgers. If you don't win games like that, you have no chance to clear 5.5. That's also a road game. You know, it's not the hardest breakdown if you want to try to piece it together for them. It doesn't add up. You've got Central Michigan and Richmond. That's 2. I mean, Indiana and Rutgers and Nebraska, and that's being kind of generous. That's still 5. You're not there yet.
I would bet the under if the juice wasn't so severe. Yeah. I still might bet it because honestly, I think there's a lot of ways this lands on 3. You mentioned the 2 gimme wins. Central and Richmond, I do think, are wins. but I think they lose every game against West opponents. You get Nebraska late, which isn't good. That's a team that's going through a full rebuild. You'd love to face them early. And then, I mean, they go to Rutgers and Indiana. They're at Indiana too. This is a team that is completely rebuilt in the portal that people just assume is going to finish last, but we don't know a lot about Indiana. They're sort of the Colorado of the Big Ten, and there's a lot of variance there. They also played them late. That's the second to last game of the year.
It's just not a great situation. You mentioned some of the games they have to have are the road games. Like, cool, you get Michigan at home. That's not going to make a difference. Like, yeah, maybe you're a little likely to pull a monumental upset, but you're not going to. That doesn't really help you out. And this is a tough one. I think I would still go under, and I'm going to look closely at this, even at minus 165. Shop this. You can find like minus 150. I would fire. I think that this is good enough to play at 5.5 because I just don't see it. And we got to move on to a team. Again, you're not going to bet these together because it would really cannibalize. But Rutgers is up next. 4.5 wins, also slightly juiced to the under. Not a lot of love for Rutgers. I do think they have some pieces, and I actually think that their non-con helps them a ton. But it's Rutgers. I mean, what do you see from this team, and how likely are they to claw to 5 wins?
Maybe in the same range as Michigan State, but that might be a little generous. You've got a new OC, Kirk Shiraka. He's traveled the Big Ten extensively at this point, but we know what he wants to do. This guy's going to be a ground and pound OC. I think that makes sense with their roster. Gavin Wimsatt, their former 4-star recruit at quarterback, is finally healthy. And it's very rare to see Rutgers with a 4-star recruit. And health has been his issue. So hopefully with a full, clean bill of health, we can get the real Gavin Wimsatt this year. Running back is strong, which fits the mold of what their OC wants to do. Sam Brown and Kyle Monangai are back. You also have a couple depth pieces there, so you should be deep. Receivers an issue. You lost your top 3, Sean Ryan, Aaron Cruikshank, and Shameen Jones. You do portal a couple interesting guys. Nassim Brantley from Western Illinois and Jaquay Jackson from Cal University of Pennsylvania. They'll join Isaiah Washington. I don't think that's a strength, but again, this team wants to run. Your tight end is back. He's awesome. Johnny Langan. Offensive line, 4 returning starters. That unit was much better run blocking than pass blocking, 1/10 in pass blocking, but again, they don't want to do it. Defense, you lose 3 DBs and 1 defensive lineman. Your defensive line is actually really good. They had top 40 pass rush numbers, which is a surprise looking at Rutgers last year. Both linebackers are back. That's solid. Your secondary has 3 players back with at least 475 snaps, and you actually had some decent guys. Michael Dixon comes over from Minnesota. You had a couple corners from the MAC, and what I like about that is you have numbers there. So if one of them fails, hopefully you can find one player who could start for you there. Their secondary was 39th. I think they take a slight step back, but I kind of like this Rutgers team a little more than Michigan State. I think I'm going to play them straight up in that game. And if I had to bet something on the Rutgers side, it'd probably be over with the plus money, but I think I'm just going to look to back Rutgers against some of the teams that I think we can fade, like Michigan State down the stretch. And not to mention, they play some weird non-con games like Virginia Tech. That could be a game to back them. There was a gross game last year. So, yeah, I like Rutgers. It's just how much can they actually improve?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're going to make a big jump. I do think plus money on 4.5 is potentially interesting because they're non-con. You've got Temple and Wagner, which is obviously useful. I might bet Rutgers in week. I mean, it's not technically week 0; it would be week 1 for them. I think Northwestern is just terrible. We'll talk about them in this episode. It's only 7 points. I think that Rutgers is going to win that game. That's 3. You got Virginia Tech, Michigan State, Indiana, and then some tougher games on the schedule, but a couple more. I think they can claw to 5. I like over 4.5 here. It's not a premier bet, but I think Rutgers is going to be competitive, and I think there's a chance that they sweep non-con because Virginia Tech's not that good.
No, they're awful, and I agree with you. It's tough. I don't think the juice is quite right to take over 4.5 for me, which is why I'm going to probably bet them against Northwestern too. I haven't yet.
Yeah, I don't get that.
I'm probably going to bet them against Temple and Virginia Tech too. I like them in all those non-con games.
Yeah, it's one of those teams that they're on the Vanderbilt track. Like if you bet this, you better hope that you literally cash it by like October, because if you don't, there's not going to be many wins later in this. Like, you need to have 3 or 4 immediately and then hope you get one more. But we'll keep it moving. Last team, and then we'll switch sides here. Indiana, you mentioned they're kind of an enigma. Maybe they're a lot better than people think. The forecast obviously is pretty dire because there's a ton of turnover, and it's only 3.5 in terms of their win total. Is it a team that maybe we just look to actionably play at times, see what we get? Or do you want to lay minus 145 to an over right off the bat?
Yeah, I don't want to play this team in the futures win total market because of all of the change on their roster. This team is 17th in the transfer rankings. So you do have upside here. Whereas, like Rutgers, Michigan State, even Maryland, I think you're kind of locked into what you are. And I mean, the upside with Indiana is that maybe that they're the 4th best team in this conference. They're not pushing anyone, but that upside is still there. You have a new quarterback. It's Taven Jackson. He's a former 4-star, was at Tennessee, kind of buried there, so no shame there. He's also, I believe, the brother of Trace Jackson Davis. So, I mean, I think he's better than Basilik, just based on recruiting profile. That should give you some upside. Running back, you basically return everyone other than Sean Shevers. You add Christian Turner to fill that void. You should be okay there. Receiver, you lose Emery Simmons or DJ Matthews. In my notes, I wrote, who cares? You still have Cam Camper. He's back from the ACL, which is fine. You move Donovan McCulley to receiver. He's a really athletic player. We'll see if he can make that jump. A couple of your transfers, EJ Williams from Clemson, a higher recruit. DeCoos Carter from Fordham. That guy was pretty good last year, over 1,000 yards there. And you have a couple 4-star receivers. You have redshirt freshman Cameron Perry and Omar Cooper. Those are both former 4-star receivers. So Indiana's not as barren talent-wise as you might think on offense. Tight end's a mess. You have 6 offensive linemen back with at least 250 snaps, and you're returning Bedford from injury. He is by far their best offensive lineman. Didn't play at all last year, so offensive line can't honestly get any worse. They were 117th, but I think they do increase to a top 100 unit at the very least. And then the defense, man, this is a Colorado defense. I do not know how to evaluate it. They were 118th last year, but they lost 5 DBs, 5 in their defensive line, 1 linebacker, only 3 returning starters, but they have 18 transfers. So I'm not going to get into the specifics on where each of these transfers went and their production. It would just take too long. But I mean, with the sheer numbers and where some of these guys came from, and the fact that they were 118th last year, I don't see any way they could be worse. So can they potentially surprise people and be a little better than Rutgers, Michigan State, and some of these teams? I think it's in the cards. Luckily, this is a team you can kind of look at early in the year and then hopefully take a stand. Like if they don't get embarrassed by Ohio State, then I'll probably be looking to back them against Louisville versus Akron, stuff like that. But I mean, they don't start easy. We'll see how they play. A lot of questions here, but I'm going to try to get a read on this team early and then make a decision for my future betting takes just in season.
Yeah, it's going to hard to really know because you start with Ohio State. That's obviously really awkward. You're a 4-touchdown underdog. Probably get killed. Then you play Indiana State. That's not really going to tell us anything. And then you get Louisville on a neutral field. So that's a fascinating game for them. Certainly they're going to need Akron and Indiana State to have any chance. And then you got to get 2 more. I think it's doable. And so do the books for what it's worth. It's minus 145. Not running to bet it, but it would be over a pass. I think Indiana would have to have a really bad year to not get to 4, honestly. I mean, there's a lot of talent relative to what they're projecting here, and they should get better as they see as the team comes together. So with the Big Ten up in the air with a lot of these teams, I think they'll probably get to 4, but again, it's not a huge value in my opinion at minus 145. But we've done one side. I can't even remember. What do they call this now? It used to be, remember when they tried to do like legends and leaders or whatever the hell it was? Is it East and West, North and South? What do they call these sides?
Just East and West to my knowledge. That's what I call them.
We're going to the other side though. Here we go. It's time. Everyone's been waiting. A son of the Midwest, an alumni, Wisconsin. Tanner Mordecai, Luke Fickell. What is going on with the Badgers? It's plus 650 to win the Big Ten, 8.5 wins, juiced to the over. This seems like a pretty dangerous squad. Are they dangerous, or are they just going to kind of do what they do?
I think they're dangerous, and I think they're especially dangerous in the future. Take a
Okay.
peek at some future Wisconsin recruiting classes. Luke Fickell has them in a place that Paul Chryst couldn't dream of. So back in on the Badgers. How high can they climb this year? I actually like this team quite a bit in year one under Fickell. He did a nice job of preparing for the future and preparing for the now. And I mean, he's a head coach he brought Cincinnati to the playoff. I mean, kids want to play for him, so he was able to snipe a lot of transfers this year. They're 24th in the transfer rankings. You get Phil Longo, that's going to revolutionize the Wisconsin offense. Those of you that are used to the ground and pound, get ready for the air raid. Mike Tressel at DC. I think the only thing you wish you had here was Jim Leonard, but unfortunately he heads down to Illinois. Regardless, love the staff. You bring in 3 quarterbacks, Tanner Mordecai, proven with SMU, over 3,500 pass yards in back-to-back years. 2 4-stars behind him in Nick Evers and Braden Locke. It's a quarterback room that Wisconsin's never seen before. This is a better quarterback room than when they had Russell Wilson. It's deeper. It has the high 4-star talent. You just don't see that. Braylon Allen's back. Somehow they were able to retain him, one of the best running backs in the Big Ten. They retain all 3 of their top receivers, Shamir Dike, Skylar Bell, Keontae Lewis, plus you add really good receivers. Will Pauling from Cincinnati. He might start in the slot. CJ Williams from USC, he's a 4-star. Bryson Green started at Oklahoma State. You have Quincy Burrows for depth from Cincinnati. This air raid attack has some really serious juice. And then at tight end, Rucci's a former pretty high recruit too, so I don't think you lose much there. 5 starters in the offensive line with at least 500 snaps, plus Joe Hubert and Jake Renfro transfer in. Nolan Rucci's a former 5-star. The offensive line is straight loaded. Defense might be a little weaker. You do lose some pretty good producers here. Herbig and Benton from the defensive line are probably going to be their biggest losses. Historically, they're pretty good at developing talent. We'll see how that changes without Jim Leonard. But I still think you have a pretty rich talent pool to pick from. Linebacker set. Corner, I think, is probably going to be set here. Luckily, you return some guys from injury. Hunter Wohler barely played last year, so he should fit right in at safety. I think this defense is solid and it's probably going to flirt with like a top 30, top 25 unit. With this schedule in the West, I think Wisconsin has a strong path to 11 wins. And you're getting their win total set at 8.5 at minus 145 around there. I don't even care about the juice with this because their toughest games are Ohio State. They get them at home. Iowa, they get them at home. Non-con's a joke. I don't see how this game or this team loses more than 2 games. So I'm going to be on the over with Wisconsin here.
I mean, again, I'm not saying that this is going to be indicative of how good they are. There's a world, an unlikely world, but there is a world where they're undefeated going into the Big Ten championship. Like if they knock off Ohio State and it is at home, they could run the table and get a rematch or play Michigan or play Penn State. I think that's unlikely, but you're not talking about 10.5. We're talking about 8.5. 8.5, 4 losses. They need to find 4 losses to not cash this. Okay, Ohio State, that's 1. You'd have to lose to Washington State probably and then get knocked off a couple other times. I don't see this at all. I mean,
me either. I don't think Washington State's a good program. We talked about them yesterday. No. You'd have to drop Iowa at home.
You still need 1 more.
Plus, we haven't talked about the rest of the Big Ten West yet. This is a conference undergoing so much change. Outside of Iowa, who retains, and this might not even be a good thing, like they retain their staff and their system, and that was terrible last year. But like almost every other program has significant change here. So Wisconsin's not at a disadvantage going through a lot of change themselves.
No, I actually think that Wisconsin's changes were needed and some of these others are forced. And let's talk about Iowa because they've come up quite a bit already in this episode with other teams. And Iowa's always, like I said, they're very scrappy. They get the most out of nothing. They get to the Big Ten championship. They get destroyed. I can't stand this team. Sorry, viewers in Iowa. It's not personal. But they're going to be competing for the West with Wisconsin. There's no doubt about it. You've got an 8-win total, again, juiced to the over. Caden McNamara, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to make of him. You know, this is not Michigan. What do you make of him? And do you think Iowa can be any more dynamic? Because it's been awful the last couple of years offensively.
I think they can be a little better with new quarterback play. You know, like this offense wasn't terrible back in the day when you had guys like Nate Stanley. No, they're never going to be Ohio State. That's just not possible with the kind of play they have and who their OC is. Speaking of which, same coaching staff, new point quota. Hopefully that can help improve the team. But I mean, going to Cade McNamara at quarterback is an upgrade. There's just no way around it. That should help the offense. He was efficient at Michigan. Some will argue he shouldn't have lost his job. He doesn't really offer anything in terms of mobility, so I disagree there. But he'll at least improve the pass game. You add Caleb Brown from Ohio State, former 4-star. That should improve the pass game. You have absolutely no depth there. I mean, like, you lost Arlen Bruce and Brody Breck, so you're basically looking at 3 quality receivers in Nico Reganey, Dante Vines, and Caleb Brown. Outside of that, you might be starting walk-ons like you did last year, which was atrocious. But as long as those guys stay healthy, I think you got a good pass game. Tight end is set. You lose Laporta, but Luke Lachey is back. Eric All comes in from Michigan. They love running 12. It's good to have both of those guys. Running back is set. Your top 2 backs are there. The offensive line should be, I think, drastically improved. They only lost 1 player, and they were super young last year. So this is a position that historically gets really good development over the years. So having 5 guys back with almost 400 snaps, I think that's awesome. And they were 126th in pass blocking last year. As bad as their quarterback play was, the offensive line didn't do that situation any favors whatsoever. Defense is good. I do have some concerns. You lose Riley Moss, Jack Campbell, Seth Benson, Kayvon Merriweather, Lucas Van Ness, among others. Those are all really good players, most of them NFL players. With that said, Iowa rotated their defensive line a ton last year. Van Ness didn't even start. So every single projected starter on the defensive line has at least 325 snaps, most of them in that 500 range. Linebacker, you do add a transfer from Virginia and Nick Jackson. He's been their leading tackler for a while, so he should slide right in. DB, I think, is solid. You return 4 players here with starting experience. Jamari Harris is back from injury to help fill that void. The only real player with questions is Xavier Nwankpa. Fortunately, I believe he's the highest recruit in program history. If not, he's, a top 5 recruit that this program has ever gotten. Really athletic player. He'll slide in and play safety. I'm actually not opposed to betting the over on Iowa and Wisconsin, and it comes down to schedule. Even if Iowa loses the head-to-head at Wisconsin, their non-con's a joke. Iowa State is a joke now with the gambling scandals. They don't even have a quarterback. You play Penn State from the East, but you draw Rutgers and Michigan State outside of that. And outside of Wisconsin, I do not fear any other Big Ten West team. There's a real path to 9 or 10 wins here. And even with the juice, I don't hate Iowa towards the over.
It's hard I would love to push back. It's schedule. Listen, you just mentioned it. They dodge some of the elite teams. Their non-con is a joke. And they just kind of grind out these games. So I think they can be a terror, like they do sometimes, and it's just how they play. Like they might finish 9-3 and 10-2, and I won't think they're a good team, to be honest. But they just rack up the wins, lose to who they're supposed to, and it can't be much worse. The whatever. We're not going to talk about the Petrus era, but it wasn't good. So if they're a little more dynamic with this schedule, I get it. I still don't think they're a serious threat. Unlike Wisconsin, who I really don't know how good they can be. If Iowa gets in that game again, they're going to be a 20-point underdog to Ohio State or Michigan or Penn State. I just don't see any way around that, and they should be. It's probably going to be one of those two, though, and maybe you disagree, but I'm interested to hear what you think of Minnesota, who has a 7-win total. It is slightly juiced to the under. We know that, obviously they built up quite a bit under Fleck, and they've had some good years. It seems now that they're kind of in this limbo land. Do they have any path to serious upside, or are they kind of just where they are?
I don't think so. And I do think it's because they took a couple steps back at key positions for this team. You have new OCs. It's going to be a co-OC situation between Greg Harbaugh Jr., Matt Simon, their internal promotion. So still expecting that same ground and pound approach from Minnesota. Tanner Morgan's gone, but luckily Kaliak Manis got some starts last year, and he actually played well as the season went on. He's mobile too. Mo Ibrahim is gone. I never thought he was particularly dynamic, but he could stand up to a massive workload. You bring in Sean Tyler from Western Michigan. I think that's probably a drop-off. At receiver, you lose Mike Brown-Stevens and Dylan Wright, but you do return some really good players. Daniel Jackson, Chris Ottman-Bell return. You add Elijah Spencer from Charlotte. He's a former All-American freshman player. and then Corey Crooms from Western Michigan as well. Those are actually pretty good receiver transfers. I don't know why they went there. You're going to a team that has a 70% run rate, so I think you could have made better decisions. Offensive line is the biggest concern here. You lose 3, and they all came on your interior, and you lose your premier center, John Michael Schmitz. I think this team takes a significant step back on the offensive line. You don't add any high-profile transfers to fill the void. You're working with depth for a team that doesn't particularly recruit well. So offensive line, they were 25th. They were 41st in the country last year. I think that's worse. Defense was 25th. They lose 5 contributors in the secondary, both linebackers, and 3 on the defensive line. Their edge is a real concern here. They lose a couple players on the edge. That team was 120th in pass rush last year. I don't think they're any better. You're returning 1 starter at linebacker, relying on Western Michigan transfer Ryan Seelig. That's a huge issue. And DB, you lost a ton. You lost 5 contributors here. You return 2 starters, but I mean, you're going to fill 3 starting positions with either depth pieces that have no snaps or portal guys that are really low level, like Jack Henderson from Southeast Louisiana, Tyler Bride from Georgia Southern, Trayvon Jones from Elon. I think this secondary is going to be rough. And you got a weak front 7. You got a weak secondary. Teams like Iowa should run on you. Teams like Wisconsin should throw on you. I don't know how you're stopping anybody with Michigan. Schedule's reasonable, so it's kind of, I go under a force to pick. I'm probably going to pass just because the rest of the conference is so weak, so they still might pick up wins. But man, I do not think this is a team that's going to actually compete for the West.
Yeah, I agree. And you're drawing Michigan and Ohio State. Not a great situation. I'm not sold on this team. I do kind of like their QB, as you mentioned, but still not enough for me to get there. I want to be clear. I did not bet this, but if I did, it would be the under. I'd be joining you there, I think. Another team, you already said this. So many teams with massive identity changes. And I think Purdue would qualify as one of them. When you look at this squad, a 5.5 win total, but very juiced to that under. So it could be a rough year there. Talk about the new personnel and just talk about Purdue in general.
Ryan Walters, your new head coach, he's defensive minded, comes from Illinois, that DC, who not only brought Illinois to awesome heights defensively, but really developed players that shouldn't be NFL picks into premier players like Devon Witherspoon. Making him go top 5 is insane. New OC is Graham Harrell from West Virginia, formerly at USC, of course. So we'll see. I think you're probably going to retain a lot of air raid stuff here. DC's Kevin Kane. He's the Illinois LB's coach from last year. New quarterbacks, Hudson Card. I don't hate Hudson Card. I think he kind of had a raw deal previously. And we'll see. I mean, he's not going to be throwing to much. So basically, he might put up counting stats because of the air raid situation, but I don't know how good they'll be. Devin Mockabee and Dylan Downing are your running backs. Mockabee is a former walk-on. Not ideal. You lost Charlie Jones, your best receiver. He's with the Bengals now. You had Brock Thompson retire. You didn't really add anything there, and you had one premier transfer, Jamal Edrin. He tore his ACL last week. So, I mean, you're working with nothing at receiver. Lost your tight end. Your offensive line lost 2 starters. You got 3 full-time guys back, but you were 69th in pass blocking last year. Even with a slight upgrade, how good is your run game going to be? Defense was 107th. You lose a ton here. And Corey Trice and Jalen Graham are drafted. I think just bringing in Walter should help this group a little bit. Your interior is good. Your edge is weak. Linebacker, you lose Graham. That's a huge loss. But again, DB is a huge question here. You return both your safeties. Kane sucked last year, so that's not great. You smash the portal. A lot of JUCO guys. Zeke Williams from Northern Illinois. I mean, Marquise Wilson from Penn State's probably your favorite to start. Just a lot of change. And I'd rather take teams like Wisconsin that I think are more talented with change here. If I was forced to bet this, probably be under. But honestly, I might just look to play Purdue late in the year once the air raid gets a little bit going, and they can maybe pick off teams like Indiana or Northwestern late, because I think they are going to face a pretty rough beginning of the schedule and maybe get roughed up a little bit against Wisconsin's early, Iowa's early, Ohio State's early, Nebraska's early, Michigan's early, and then you got your last 3 against Minnesota, Northwestern, Indiana. So maybe just playing them late.
Yeah, and even further, you want to talk about early, they have a manageable non-con, but they don't have any gimmies. There are equity that they're just straight 0-3 and dead in non-con. Fresno State is their first game at home. they're a 5.5-point favorite. So like you can lose that game, then you go to Virginia Tech, who's not very good, but you could lose that, and then you've got Syracuse. Like, it's not great. So you better hope you're 2-1, because if you're 1-2 or 0-3, you're not getting to 6. And there's like real equity. You're like 1 or 2-7 going late into the year. So I'm worried about Purdue in that. I'm not going to bet it just because I want to see it. If they smash Fresno State, maybe it's a team that we can buy on as they get more acclimated. I believe in what they're doing. Just not sure that it's right now. But we've got a couple teams left. Again, if you have any questions, we don't get to it, at Matt_Gajeski, at JazzRazGFS. We're here. We're on OddsShopper. Again, just get involved. The links are in the description of this video. It doesn't mean you have to sign up for everything, but at least check out the offers. They're there to help you guys. We want you involved. We want you to have access to all the tools and all the promos that are out there. And that is really the best way to do it. I can't say it enough before seasons get started. The Illini are up next. Okay, 6.5 wins, -110 on both sides. Honestly, at various points in the summer, I thought I was going to bet the over and the under. That's probably a sign that I shouldn't do anything. I can't get a read on this team at all. Do you have a read on how good Illinois is going to be? It's moved to -115 to the over. Little action, I guess, on people buying on Illinois.
I don't hate Illinois. I like their head coach, Brett Bielema, and he gets a lot of flack from his time at Arkansas. But, I mean, I think people kind of misconstrue coaching sometimes, and there's levels to this. You know, he was highly successful at Wisconsin. Wisconsin's like a top 30-ish program in the country. You go down to Arkansas, where they have aspirations to compete with LSU and Alabama. Like, expectations are different, schedule's different. I think Brett Bielema is probably like a top 30 head coach in the country who just went a little too high and failed, and now he's back at a program where he can succeed. So I like him. Like their OC, Barry Lunney, he's awesome. Former UTSA guy, runs a lot of different stuff, and he'll morph his offense to his player personnel. On defense, you promote Aaron Henry to replace Walters. He's your DB's coach. But they got Jim Leonard, man. Like, he's going to just function as an assistant this year. That's a pretty good former DC, like maybe one of the top DCs in the country, just to have on your staff as an analyst. And I mean, he coached previously with Bielema, so there's familiarity. But man, great get in the coaching market. I think you have more upside at QB with Luke Altmaier, former 4-star. We'll see. I don't think he's any worse than the quarterback situation they had last year. Obviously, the biggest losses are going to be Chase Brown and then your O-line. Chase Brown's gone. Huge loss. He was the engine of their offense. You lose 2 on the O-line. You got 3 starters back, and your sixth man, if you will, Jordan Slaughter's back too. So I think it'll be pretty good running the ball. Reggie Love and Josh McCray were good in a small sample. If they could even be 85% of Chase Brown, you still should have a dynamic rushing attack. Top 3 receivers are back. If Altmaier is any good, and with UTSA formerly, this offense will be pass heavy if personnel calls for it. And I think they might, just with these receivers back. You got Williams back. You have Pat Bryant, who popped really well in a small sample, and Casey Washington. Defense is the biggest concern. Last year, the strength was largely your secondary. You lose 4 NFL guys: Witherspoon, Sidney Brown, Martin, and Smith. The only returner is basically your nickel. You're going to rely entirely on transfers here. But your front seven's awesome. Jerzon Newton is a name to know. This is a guy that's going to get drafted highly last year. You return most of this defensive line and most of your linebacking core. In the Big Ten West, really, you're worried about opposing running attacks. So aside from Wisconsin and maybe Purdue with Graham Harrell, I still think this defense is going to hold up just based on where they're built. Strong front seven, questions in the secondary. With the way opposing Big Ten teams want to play them, that should still lead to a lot of wins for Illinois. Tough-ish schedule, so it's kind of a no bet for me, but I don't hate this team.
Yeah, again, another team that I think their non-con is interesting. You got Toledo and Kansas and FAU. You probably get 2. You could get 3. You could get 1. That's where it's really tricky with these teams, and I'm not sure that really sets me up for an actionable play. And it's partly because, again, you always have to I'm with you on Wisconsin, even Iowa, as much as that pains me. And then Nebraska, who last year, I believe they were my first click. And it was a disaster from the moment the season started when they tried that onside kick in Dublin and lost to Northwestern, and they never recovered. New regime. Nebraska's probably never getting back to what they expect, but can they even be remotely competent this year? Unlike last year, 6 wins, juice to the over. Is Nebraska going bowling? Can we buy on them this year?
I think they're going bowling, and I think there's an outside chance they're the third best team in this conference, this division of this conference. They're 25th in recruiting. They're 27th in the transfer portal rankings. So unlike previous Matt Rule stops, and a lot of people reference this stat, he puts his culture first. He's going to build a program. If that means he wins 2 or 3 games year one, doesn't care. Well, he's 27 in the transfer portal rankings. It's a different era now since the previous time he coached at Baylor. You can put a Band-Aid over a lot of your previous issues, and he's done just that. Jeff Sims comes in at quarterback. This should be the most talented quarterback they've played with in a while. I know they had Adrian Martinez for a while. Casey Thompson is what he is. Sims can run. He's a decent thrower. Had a horrific situation at Georgia Tech, and he ran off Thompson in the spring, so I think that's positive. All your running backs of consequence are back, aside from A.J. Allen. I think receiver is going to be pretty strong for you. You lose Trey Palmer, but you bring in Billy Kemp. This is a proven commodity out of the slot for Virginia, in addition to Marcus Washington. They got a really good recruit here, Malachi Coleman. He's a top 100 player in the country. I think he plays immediately at receiver. Tight end is fine. I don't care about Arik Gilbert. I don't think he plays. The guy just has, I don't know. I hope he gets right off the field. He's got a lot of problems. Offensive line can't be any worse. They were 129th last year. You have 5 starters back. You had 2 pretty good transfers. A lot of injuries, too, like Teddy Prochazka, your projected left tackle, was hurt after 3 games. I don't know how good they'll be, but they're going to be better. Defense, you got a lot of really good recruits and transfers, especially in your front 7. You have 3 recruits of at least 4-star caliber who I think get significant time here. That just gives you upside you haven't had before. MJ Sherman, Chief Borders, Elijah Judy, those guys are all going to play in your front 7. And then you have 5 starters back in the secondary. Most are above average. If those recruits and transfers play at a decent level, Nebraska is going to be really improved on defense. And they were 102nd last year. I think they climb into the top 75. Now, decent amount to put together. But if they do all that, I think this roster is better than Purdue, Illinois, and Minnesota.
Such a weird schedule. You open double road game. You never see that for like a bigger school. At Minnesota, at Colorado. Then you get Northern Illinois and Louisiana Tech. I guess you should be 3-1 in there. I mean, it's a very delicate situation. They're non-con. Again, I've said this a couple of times. You got to get 2. You could survive with 2. 3 is the goal in non-con. Minnesota's a tough game right off the bat. If you can do that, Northwestern's on the schedule. Illinois, Michigan State, Purdue, Maryland. Yeah, it's there. That offensive line has to be improved, though. I think that's one of the many keys here. 150 is a little juicy, but certainly you have push equity, and I do think they get to 7 a hell of a lot more than 5, as do the books. So why not? I did it last year. One more time with Matt Rule and the boys. With the Cornhuskers, last team. This is a team, man. Northwestern. Yikes. It's bad. Obviously, they've got a lot of problems off the field. I didn't think they were going to be any good to begin with, but this certainly hasn't helped. I believe a couple guys portaled since this. How bad is it, and is 3 enough?
Yeah, it's real bad. Their best recruit portaled. He's at Ohio State now. You have an interim head coach who was projected to be your DC. He's also a first-year DC, David Braun. He's not making enough money to handle this situation. I don't know if there's enough money to coach at Northwestern right now. The program's not winnable. It's like Virginia. It's like Stanford. Your admissions are too high to recruit at a high level. Your transfer restrictions, and this is just academic transfers. So many programs don't have their credits transfer over that you really can't get a lot of good players coming in the portal. You do get Ben Bryant. It's probably an upgraded quarterback. I don't know who he's throwing to. His top 2 receivers are gone. You also had Cam Johnson from Arizona State and AJ Henning at receiver. Henning's a high recruit. Johnson played at Vandy, played at Arizona State, had some production at Vandy, couldn't crack the rotation at Arizona State, so I have questions about how good he is. You have horrific ability to develop talent here. Like, you've lost 4-star receivers to the portal already. You had a 4-star last year, and Reggie Flarima, he's listed as a 3rd stringer. Like, what are you doing? You have to start your 4 stars at Nebraska, or excuse me, at Northwestern. I don't care if they're not that good. Get them on the field, develop them. They're more talented than your players. You can't be deferring this to this like senior leadership at this point in the game in college football. It's not going to work. Offensive line lost 4 starters, Peter Skoronski being the headliner there. Your defense lost a ton of production. It was 124th. How bad could it possibly be? Well, it can be really bad because you can't portal anybody. So I think this defense is going to be awful again. I think the most likely outcome is 2 wins. Just looking at the schedule, you've got UTEP, and then, I mean, maybe you could pick off one other one, but man, Howard is probably it, but I don't think you're winning more than 2, and I don't think UTEP's a gimme.
No, it's not. Don't sleep on UTEP. I like UTEP this year. They play an absolute joke schedule. They're not in the Big Ten, but UTEP's not a gimme. Howard, obviously, that should be a win. But where you're not going to beat Duke.
Definitely not.
And then we say it every show to kind of close it out. But this one, I think, might be the strongest one. I'll actually open it up this way. Of all the Power 5 conferences, I think Northwestern is the most likely team to not win a conference game of any team in the country.
Yeah, I think it's between them and Stanford. I agree with you. Vandy's way better. I think the bottom end of the ACC is better with Virginia, and then the Big 12 is the Big 12. That the last place team could win it all.
Yeah, this is just a random number generator. I really think that Northwestern might be the team to finish with 0 conference wins, and that could be difficult in terms of cashing a win total if you're ineligible to cash it, because you're going to have to find a conference win to do just that. So keep an eye on that. You can shop it. But we have talked about 14 teams in the Big Ten, but let's talk summary of our best bets here. Big Ten best bets, a couple quick win total. You got some money to spare before the season. If you were doing that, what would be your top bets for the Big Ten before the season kicks off?
My top 2 bets are Wisconsin over 8.5 wins. You'll find that slightly juiced, but there's a lot of paths to this team going 11-1. Easy non-conference schedule. Ohio State's at home. I still think they lose, but that's at least a feather in your cap. Rest of your crossover is manageable, and then you've got the Big Ten West. They're going to be favored in 11 games this year. You're finding this at 8.5. Second for me would be Penn State. I don't care really how you play this. I like a couple bets. I think this team is live to win the Big Ten. You're going to find that around 5-1. Shop it. But their roster's on par with Ohio State and Michigan, especially now that they have new quarterback Alar, good running back room, strong offensive line and defense. Don't hate them at 22-1 to win the Natty either. So I think you can play around with how you want to look at Penn State, but multiple ways to play them. Iowa would be my third. Easy schedule for them. See a lot of paths to 10 wins. But my top 2 are going to be Wisconsin over 8.5. Penn State to win the Big Ten. Penn State to win the national championship.
I'm going to add in, again, much more conservative, but Penn State over 9.5 wins at -140. I just do not see them losing 3 games, even if they lose to Ohio State and Michigan, which I do not think is a guarantee by any stretch. They will be pretty heavy favorites in the other 10 games. If they get one of those wins, particularly a night game probably in their home stadium, then you've got 2 games to play with, and I really don't see that. I think Penn State is going to go 11-1 on the season. I think that's one of the best win totals in the entire country. So put that one at the top for me. I'm going to short Michigan State. That would be the only other team that I want to throw out there. I just think there's a lot of questions. You mentioned they really don't have an answer at quarterback right now. They've got a lot of question marks. Of course, their schedule's difficult. Washington and non-con. I think it's going to be pretty rough for them. Can they pick off a couple teams? Sure, but I don't see massive upsets. And their games that they need are road games. Some of those easier opponents, they have to travel on the road to the Indianas of the world and things like that. I worry about Michigan State this year. So in addition to echoing your thoughts on Wisconsin and Penn State, I am going to short Michigan State if you're looking for a couple quick Big Ten bets. But I just want to say thanks as always. Again, no matter where you're watching this, listen to this on podcasts, just supporting us here at Odd Chopper. We cannot wait to talk week 0. It is almost here. We're going to have a Big 12 breakdown coming up. You can catch all the other conferences on this very YouTube channel. But for me, for Matt, and for everybody here, good luck. Enjoy all the prep before the season gets underway. And of course, stop by soon for even more college football.